The sky over the city was clouded in a grayish haze, but it didn't dampen the charm that always drew David back to this neighborhood. He stepped carefully down the polished cobblestone street, its stones slick with recent rain, carrying himself with a calm confidence. He had dressed sharply for the occasion, wearing a tailored navy blazer and a button-down shirt, crisp and clean under his favorite wool coat. Today was a rare day off, and he decided to spend it in the historic district, the old heartbeat of the city, wandering the antique shops and artisanal cafes that dotted the area. A scent drifted by, faint but familiar, a blend of leather, aged wood, and faintly perfumed wax. David followed it to an unassuming storefront that looked as though it had remained unchanged since its original construction. Tall arched windows framed the entryway, through which glimpses of heavy mahogany counters, plush green carpeting, and brass fixtures glinted dimly. Above the doorway, painted in fading, elegant lettering, was a name he couldn't quite make out. He adjusted his glasses and squinted. Some letters were chipped, others faded beyond recognition, and the grime of decades added a foggy patina. As he lingered in front of the door, a quiet sense of nostalgia welled up within him. David had always been drawn to places like this. His passion for history wasn't just professional, it was visceral, part of him in ways that sometimes made him feel like a man out of time. His family had roots in this city that went back generations, but for reasons he couldn't fully explain, their personal history was something they rarely discussed. It was as if there were things they were reluctant to remember, or perhaps things they tried too hard to forget. A small plaque caught his eye, barely visible under a dusty film that softened the gold lettering. He leaned in, brushing off some of the dirt with his fingers to reveal the words beneath, dedicated to the founder, visionary, leader, friend. Below it, only a partial name could be deciphered, a string of initials and letters that seemed frustratingly familiar yet unplaceable. He ran his fingers over the letters, the cool metal slick against his skin. Something here felt important. The sound of footsteps jarred him out of his thoughts, and David turned to see a man approaching from behind the counter, his expression stony, eyebrows knitted together in a mixture of irritation and something almost like suspicion. The man wore a tailored suit, neat but old-fashioned, with a tie clip just below his collar. His gaze landed on David with a cool detachment that felt palpably dismissive. "Can I help you with something?" the man asked, each word clipped as though spoken through clenched teeth. David noticed the way the man's eyes swept over him, lingering on his shoes, his coat, and, ultimately, his face. There was an uncomfortable pause, punctuated by the manager's tight-lipped stare, before he continued. "We usually don't get visitors like, well, let's just say, this store caters to a specific clientele." David felt a flicker of irritation, but he kept his expression calm. Instead of responding, he let his gaze drift back to the small framed photo on the wall beside the counter. It showed a group of people gathered outside the store, posed stiffly in early 20th century fashion, their expression solemn and dignified. There was something haunting about the image, something in the way the figures stared out as if guarding secrets from a bygone era. A tall black man stood near the back, half obscured by another figure. His face was only partially visible, yet David felt inexplicably drawn to him. The manager's gaze hardened, noticing David's interest in the photo. "The store's founder and his associates," he said dismissively, "but the history's irrelevant to most people today." There was an unmistakable tone of dismissal, as though he assumed David wouldn't, or couldn't, understand the significance. David nodded, pretending not to notice the man's attitude. But something in the photo pulled at him. The dim recognition stirred deeper now, unsettling in its familiarity. And then it struck him. He'd seen that face before, or rather, he'd seen something just like it in a photograph buried in an old family album, tucked away in his mother's attic. With quiet resolve, David turned back to the manager. "It's actually a fascinating history, isn't it? You never know what you'll uncover when you look close enough." David didn't grow up with the privilege of certainty. While many of his friends were raised with a strong sense of their family's place in the world, David's family history was a patchwork of stories, silences, and the occasional hint of shame. He'd been told about his ancestor only in whispers and carefully chosen words, stories shared in snippets during family gatherings or late-night conversations, when walls seemed to hold secrets and shadows grew long. For David, his heritage was always a bit of a mystery, a well-intentioned secret, one kept out of fear or reverence, and perhaps both. As a boy, David would occasionally sit with his grandmother, a tall, dignified woman with a quiet resilience about her. On rare occasions, when she let herself remember, she would pull out a small, faded photograph, yellowed at the edges and frayed from years of handling. It showed a man with strong features, dressed in a sharp suit, standing outside a modest storefront with a small but proud sign. David had once asked who the man was, but his grandmother's response was always evasive. She would call him a businessman, a respected man of the community, but her words trailed off as though she'd ventured too close to something painful. Over time, David came to understand that his ancestor had built something of significance, a legacy, a business, perhaps even a small empire. Yet he'd also sensed that this man had faced barriers that had made his success bittersweet, possibly even dangerous. Though never openly discussed, there were hints of financial ruin, legal challenges, and, worst of all, outright erasure. When David once asked why the family didn't still own the store, his grandmother's face tightened. "We weren't the kind of people they wanted in charge," she'd murmured, her voice almost a whisper. That simple statement had stuck with him. In college, David chose to study history, specializing in urban development and the forgotten stories of marginalized pioneers. As he dug into archives, he uncovered countless tales of Black entrepreneurs, builders, and innovators whose names had been erased or buried under someone else's accomplishments. These stories resonated deeply, not just intellectually, but personally. They mirrored his family's experience, feeding a quiet, stubborn sense of purpose. He began to see himself not just as a historian, but as a custodian of lost narratives, a role he felt destined to play. But his path wasn't without its obstacles. As a Black man in the academic and business world, David encountered his fair share of resistance. Even as he published articles, led public talks, and helped organize community projects, he often found himself sidelined or his contributions attributed to others. It was a painful reminder that his own achievements, like those of his ancestor, might not be remembered as he intended. The frustration was compounded by the knowledge that his family still preferred not to discuss their past in detail, as if afraid that dredging it up would open old wounds. Professionally, David was successful. He had curated several exhibits highlighting underrepresented figures in urban history, and he'd received offers to expand his projects nationwide. But his personal life was more complicated. The intense focus on his work left little room for relationships, and he often felt isolated, caught between two worlds. His colleagues respected him, but few understood the deeply personal stakes that drove his work. His family, meanwhile, respected his success but couldn't share in his passion. They saw his work as noble, but perhaps misguided, a challenge to forces that were better left undisturbed. For David, the past wasn't just history. It was a source of identity, a way to reclaim a sense of belonging that had been denied to him. And so, standing in front of that old plaque in the store, with its faintly familiar name, David felt an urgent, almost desperate need to uncover the truth. He was done with secrets, done with whispered stories and unspoken traumas. It was time to reclaim his family's place in history, to rewrite the story that had been stolen from them. The store had a quietness about it that felt old, as if the walls themselves held their breath. David moved through the space with purpose, glancing over his shoulder at the manager before pausing in front of the photograph again. The frame was worn, its once gold edges tarnished to a dull bronze, and the image inside was slightly faded, the faces blurred by age and time. But one face, toward the back of the group, caught his eye. A man in a dark, fine suit. Standing a step apart from the rest, his expression both reserved and quietly dignified. David leaned in, squinting, trying to make out the details in the shadowed face. There was something about the man's posture, the way he held himself with an unmistakable authority despite being relegated to the back of the group. The others in the photo, a few women in long dresses, a cluster of men in old-fashioned work clothes, stood with open, almost triumphant expressions. But this man's gaze was different, distant and restrained, as if he were aware of his place at the fringes, yet determined not to be diminished by it. He felt a chill run down his spine as he took in the man's features, the high cheekbones, the dark eyes, the slight arch of his brow that seemed to communicate a silent confidence. There was a resemblance, faint but undeniable, that stirred something deep and restless in David. It was as if he were staring at a ghost, a silent witness who demanded to be seen. "What's his story?" David asked, his voice barely more than a murmur. The question hung in the air, carrying with it a mix of curiosity and longing. The manager, who had been watching him with an increasingly annoyed expression, raised an eyebrow. He stepped forward with deliberate slowness, as though reluctant to engage, and then let out a sigh. "Oh, that old photo. It's just of the founder and his associates." "Not much else to say," he replied, his voice stiff and dismissive. "We don't have information on everyone in it. Only the important figures, of course." David's stomach tightened at the words. Only the important figures. He shot a look at the manager, who simply shrugged, clearly uninterested in discussing the subject further. David had encountered this attitude before, the kind of casual dismissal that, whether intentional or not, placed certain people and stories on the periphery, relegating them to footnotes. "I see," David replied, trying to keep his voice steady. He glanced back at the photograph, his curiosity now burning. "And would you happen to know the founder's name?" The manager looked at him as though he were questioning something so obvious it hardly needed saying. "Mr. Lawrence Whitfield, the founder of Whitfield and Company," he said, as though reciting from a well-worn script. His expression was faintly amused, like David had just revealed himself to be an outsider who didn't belong here. David nodded, but he wasn't satisfied. There was something here, something the manager either didn't know or didn't care to know. His gaze drifted over the photograph again, lingering on the man at the back. What would it take to learn more about him? And why did his face feel so familiar, as though David had seen it somewhere in his own family's past? As he moved away from the photograph, a faint marking on the wall behind the counter caught his eye. David stepped forward, squinting, and saw what appeared to be faint, jagged initials carved into the dark wood paneling, partially obscured by age and wear. He felt a flicker of recognition as he traced the letters with his gaze. CW, the initials seemed roughly hewn, as if someone had carved them hurriedly, or perhaps in defiance. They were small, unassuming, but they held a quiet power that felt deliberate, as if they'd been left as a marker, a silent claim in a place where voices were otherwise erased. David's mind raced. The initials matched his ancestor's name, Caleb Whitman, a name he'd seen on old family records, though rarely mentioned aloud. He felt a strange, urgent need to know more, to understand why his family's name might be here, hidden in plain sight, but obscured by layers of time and neglect. The manager's voice interrupted his thoughts. "Is there something else you need?" he asked, his tone implying that David's presence had become an inconvenience. But David only offered a polite smile, concealing the fire that now burned within him. "No, thank you. I think I've seen what I needed to." But as he left, his gaze lingered on the initials, and he promised himself he would be back. There was a story here, a buried truth that called to him, and he wasn't about to walk away. David couldn't shake the feeling that the old store held secrets, and he was determined to find them. The initials on the wall, the dismissed photo of the man in the background. All these clues simmered in his mind, teasing him with questions that felt both personal and profound. That evening, he returned to his office, an eclectic space filled with carefully arranged books, stacks of old maps, and photographs lining the walls. He settled into his desk, the only light coming from the green glow of his banker's lamp, casting a warm circle over the stacks of city records he pulled. He began with city archives, digging into documents about the store's original ownership. It didn't take long for him to notice gaps in the records, subtle absences that only someone attuned to historical erasure would pick up on. The store, officially opened in 1898, had been registered under Lawrence Whitfield's name alone. But as David combed through ledgers and permits, he noticed a few strange annotations, notations about support from private sources. Though none of the records stated it explicitly, he could sense a pattern, as if someone else's name should have been there. Someone who had been essential to the store's early success, but had been erased from official documentation. Intrigued, David decided to dig deeper, leaving the archives the next morning to visit the city's historical society. There, among dusty ledgers and stacks of brittle newspapers, he found a photograph that sent a jolt of recognition through him. It was an old promotional flyer, dated a few years after the store's opening. The image depicted the store in its early days, grand and newly constructed, with a group of well-dressed men standing proudly in front of it. David scanned the faces, his heart pounding as he recognized the faint shadow of the man from the framed photograph in the store. But something was odd about the image. The face of the black man in the photo, his ancestor, he felt almost certain, had been scratched out. A small, cruel act of defacement that suggested someone had deliberately tried to erase this figure from history. A chill ran through David's spine as he examined the scratches, the white streaks cutting across the man's features like a violent insult frozen in time. Whoever had done this had gone out of their way to deny this man recognition, as if his very presence was a threat to the narrative the store wanted to project. Taking a deep breath, David held the photograph under better light, hoping to make out some detail in the scratched-out face. It was hard to tell, but he thought he could make out the slight glint of glasses and the outline of a sharp, confident jaw. The resemblance to his ancestor felt undeniable now, sending a warm surge of vindication through him. He was on the right track. David's thoughts whirled. Why had this man been erased? And who had gone to such lengths to do it? He knew he needed to speak to people who might remember, who might know fragments of the stories left out of the records. So, he began making a list of elderly locals, names he remembered from past interviews for other projects, people who had seen the city change over the decades and might still recall stories that hadn't made it into the history books. A few days later, David found himself seated across from Mrs. B. Langston, a retired librarian and local historian with a sharp wit and an enviable memory. She was in her 80s, but her mind was as keen as ever. When he showed her the flyer, she squinted, her fingers lightly tracing the scratched-out face. "Oh, I know this store," she said, her voice a mix of nostalgia and bemusement. "They've kept it running all these years, haven't they? But I'll tell you, back in the day, it wasn't just Whitfield. A lot of folks helped make this place what it was. Just that, well, only certain people ever got the credit." David felt his pulse quicken. "What do you mean, Mrs. Langston? Do you remember hearing anything about an anonymous investor, maybe?" She looked at him thoughtfully, her eyes narrowing as if she were deciding how much to share. "Not anonymous to us, son," she said with a chuckle. "People talked. There was a gentleman who came by, often enough to be noticed. Tall, well-dressed. Always kept to himself, though. But everyone knew he was important. You know what I mean? Important in ways you can't write down on paper." David nodded, swallowing hard. "Do you remember his name?" Mrs. Langston paused, her gaze drifting off as she recalled memories buried deep in the folds of time. "Can't say for certain, but the men used to call him Mr. C. If he ever had a full name, I don't know that I heard it. But I remember the pride in his walk, the way he would stand straight, even when folks tried to look through him." She gave a sad smile, her fingers brushing the face in the photograph one last time. He wasn't the kind to let people erase him, not easily. David thanked her, leaving her with the photograph as a memento. He left with a new name, Mr. C, though the name left him with as many questions as answers. Still, the puzzle pieces were starting to fit together. The initials on the wall, the erased man in the photograph, and the whispered stories of Mr. C. He felt a surge of excitement, as though he were on the edge of something significant, something that could rewrite the history not only of the store but of his family. Back at the archives, David unearthed a faded blueprint of the original store. Running his fingers over the delicate paper, he saw faint initials in the corner. CW, they matched his ancestors, Caleb Whitman, and the date suggested it was created right before the store's opening. It wasn't conclusive, but it felt too coincidental to ignore. David took a deep breath, piecing together the implications. He could almost see it now, his ancestor, a successful entrepreneur. somehow tied to this store but carefully excluded from its official history. An anonymous financial backer, an influential figure who had been gradually pushed to the edges until his name disappeared altogether. David's heart ached with a mix of frustration and pride. This was his family's legacy, hidden in plain sight, preserved in only the faintest whispers and fragments. The next morning, David returned to the store, this time armed with his findings and a new determination. He stepped inside, his gaze going immediately to the photograph on the wall, and then to the manager, who looked up with a raised brow. "Ah, you're back," the manager said, barely concealing his impatience. "Yes, I am," David replied with a steady gaze, "and I have a few questions. You see, I found some interesting documents about this place. Did you know that the store might have had a silent partner, someone who helped get it off the ground?" The manager's face went blank, a flicker of something uncomfortable passing over his features. "I don't think I can help you with that," he said coolly, avoiding David's gaze. David pressed on, a spark of defiance in his eyes. "Maybe not. But the archives can, and so can the people who remember." The manager's lips tightened, his usual composure slipping for a brief moment. "This store has a long, proud history," he said, his voice controlled but strained. "Not everyone has a place in it." David felt a surge of anger, but he forced himself to stay calm, offering a small, knowing smile. Maybe not everyone was given a place, but that doesn't mean they didn't belong here. The manager looked away, uncomfortable, and David knew he'd struck a nerve. He left the store feeling a renewed determination. His journey wasn't just about discovering the truth. It was about reclaiming it, about honoring a legacy that had been buried for too long. And with every clue he uncovered, he felt his ancestors' presence more strongly, guiding him toward a history that deserved to be known. David's initial excitement began to fade as the roadblocks stacked up. After days of digging, he realized that certain records were simply missing. Key documents from the city archives and financial statements from the store's early days were nowhere to be found. It was as if parts of history had been deliberately erased or locked away, leaving frustrating gaps in his research. He'd spent hours calling and emailing local historians, only to face polite but firm resistance. They dismissed his inquiries as unimportant or, worse, sensationalist. One of them even sighed, adding, "You know, some stories are better left alone. We don't need to dig up old controversies." Frustration gnawed at him. What harm could come from simply uncovering the truth? Wasn't that what historians were supposed to do? Preserve and honor the legacies of the past, especially those that had been overlooked. He remembered Mrs. Langston's words about Mr. C. and her careful caution, but even she hadn't fully understood his connection to the story. There was a point at which David realized he was practically alone in this search, except for the whispers of a man whose image had been scratched from a photograph. Just when he thought he couldn't feel more alone, his phone buzzed with a call from his mother. He answered it, surprised at her tone, curt, almost strained. "David, I heard about what you're doing," she said, her voice low, as though speaking too loudly might let out secrets she wished to keep hidden. "What do you mean?" he replied, even though he could sense exactly where this was headed. "You're asking around about Caleb," she said, a hint of disapproval coloring her tone. "And I think it's time we had a talk." That evening, David found himself seated across from his mother in her living room, the old family photos on the wall feeling like silent observers. She watched him carefully, as if assessing him. Finally, she spoke. "David, I know you're passionate about your work," she began, "but there are things you need to understand about the past, and why we don't dig into certain stories." He raised an eyebrow. "Are you telling me to stop? This is our history, Mom. Shouldn't we be proud of it?" She let out a sigh, her gaze distant. "It's not that simple, David. Caleb, he endured a lot. The world he lived in didn't see him the way we do now. His accomplishments were different back then. They weren't celebrated. They were hidden, shamed, even denied." David could hear the pain in her voice, and for a moment, he questioned his pursuit. Was he dishonoring his family's wishes by exposing a history they deliberately kept quiet? Was he dredging up old wounds that would only lead to more pain? "Mom," he began softly, "I can't ignore this. I've already found too much. Don't you think it's time his story was known?" She shook her head, her expression a mixture of sadness and fear. "Sometimes history isn't about truth. It's about survival. You'll understand one day." She gave him a long look, then added, "Please, think about it." He left her house that night with a sense of doubt gnawing at him, her words echoing in his mind. Was he pursuing the past at the cost of his family's peace? Should he let it go, leave his ancestors' story where it had been hidden for so long? For days, the questions lingered, chipping away at his confidence. But he couldn't shake the image of the man in the photograph, standing proudly even as he was scratched from history. And so, despite his family's reservations, David found himself back at the archives, combing through records, determined to find any shred of truth. That's when he met Kendra, a young archivist with sharp eyes and an inquisitive nature. She noticed him poring over the old ledgers and offered a warm smile. "You've been here almost every day," she observed. "Researching something special?" David hesitated, unsure if he should divulge his purpose. But something in Kendra's expression, a glint of curiosity, a willingness to help, made him feel comfortable enough to share. He explained his quest, his suspicions, and the numerous dead ends he hit. Kendra's eyes lit up. "That sounds incredible," she said, leaning in. "We don't get many people willing to dig this deep, especially not for stories that might shake things up." "Tell me about it," David replied, a weary smile on his face. "It seems like the city doesn't want me finding anything about this. I've been blocked at every turn." She paused, glancing around as if to make sure no one else was listening, then lowered her voice. "You know, we have some restricted files in the back, financial records, land deeds, stuff that isn't exactly on public display. I could help you access them. It's risky, but if you're serious, we might find something." David's heart raced. This was exactly the breakthrough he needed, though he couldn't shake a nagging feeling of hesitation. The words of his mother echoed in his mind, warning him of the dangers of stirring up the past. But he pushed the doubt aside. He was too close to stop now. Under the dim light of Kendra's small workspace, David pored over the newly uncovered files. The documents were yellowed with age, some barely legible, but they painted a vivid picture of the store's early years. One document, in particular, caught his eye, a partnership agreement from 1897, signed by both Lawrence Whitfield and another name, Caleb Whitman. David's heart pounded as he read the terms, detailing a financial agreement in which Caleb's investments had been essential to the store's launch. There it was in black and white, proof that his ancestor hadn't just been a silent investor, but an integral partner in the store's creation. But as he read on, his excitement was tempered by a heavy realization. Attached to the agreement was a letter from Caleb himself, one that seemed to tremble with bitterness and sorrow. The words blurred before David's eyes as he took in the heartbreaking message. "Mr. Whitfield, I write this letter not out of anger, but with the understanding that we live in a world that demands silence from men like me. I understand that the recognition will not be mine, that the fruits of our labor will bear only your name. Still, I cannot help but hope that one day the truth of our partnership will see the light. Until then, I will remain in the shadows, as so many of us do." David's hands shook as he read the words, feeling the weight of his ancestors' pain and dignity. Caleb had known he would be erased, and yet he had carried on, giving his money, his effort, and his reputation to help build something that he would never be able to claim as his own. It was a bittersweet triumph, the knowledge that his ancestor's name was etched into the foundations of the store, even if the world had never acknowledged it. David felt a mix of pride and sadness, his heart aching for a man who had given so much yet received so little in return. As David left the archives that evening, he found Kendra waiting for him. She gave him a soft, understanding smile. "You found something, didn't you?" she asked. He nodded, feeling the weight of his discovery settle on his shoulders. "More than I expected," he replied, his voice heavy with emotion. "My ancestor, he sacrificed so much, and he was willing to do it without any recognition." Kendra placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. Sometimes, the ones who are erased from history are the ones who shape it the most. David's resolve hardened, his doubts falling away. He knew now that he couldn't walk away from this story, no matter the resistance he faced. His family's legacy deserved to be known, and his ancestors' contributions deserved to be honored. For the first time, he understood that his journey wasn't just about uncovering a forgotten history. It was about giving his ancestor a voice that could finally be heard, even after all these years. He turned back to Kendra, gratitude in his eyes. "Thank you for helping me see this through." She smiled, nodding. "I believe in what you're doing, David, and I think Caleb would be proud." As David walked out into the cool night air, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The obstacles had only made his resolve stronger, his curiosity sharpened. He was ready to face whatever came next, knowing that every step he took brought him closer to reclaiming his ancestors' place in history, and to healing a legacy that had waited far too long to be acknowledged. David was seated in Kendra's office, surrounded by stacks of dusty records and yellowing documents. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and faded ink, and the dim light from the desk lamp gave the room an almost sacred feeling. Kendra had helped him track down the last remaining document, an untouched, faded ledger containing the store's founding financial records. It was here, she had said, that he might find his ancestors' final mark. Holding his breath, David flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning line after line of transactions and signatures, hoping for something, anything, that would confirm the truth he'd been pursuing for so long. And then he saw it. In an entry dated over a century ago, his ancestor's name was listed as a co-investor in the establishment's earliest days. Caleb Whitman, his ancestor, had been, without any question, an equal partner in the store's founding. Yet beside his name, a faint line had been drawn, almost as if someone had tried to erase it, yet hadn't dared to fully cross it out. Below it, a scrawled note read, "Do not publicize, for internal reference only." David's heart clenched. It wasn't just a transaction. This was deliberate. Someone had made the decision to bury his ancestor's role, to downplay his achievements. His ancestors' contributions were being systematically hidden, and for what? To make a store more palatable to customers who couldn't accept a black man as a key figure in their local institution. His mind churned, processing the deep injustice. Caleb hadn't just been a silent partner. He had been erased. He sank back in his chair, a flood of memories hitting him. Stories he'd pieced together from family members who would only speak in whispers about Caleb, the strained glances, the sense of loss woven into the Whitman family history. David closed his eyes, feeling the years of silence stretch between him and Caleb, who had given so much only to see it stripped away. "Kendra," he managed, his voice barely a whisper, "it's true. They erased him." Kendra placed a hand on his shoulder. "I can't imagine how hard this is, David. But your ancestor deserves for his story to be told, and you're the one who can finally give it to him." She was right, he knew. Caleb hadn't labored in vain, and he certainly hadn't done it expecting recognition. But this was more than recognition. It was reclaiming his dignity, his humanity, from a time that refused to see it. Determined to keep looking, David pored over more documents until he came across a ledger entry with a curious footnote. Following the entry's reference, Kendra located an old file in the back shelves, a slim bundle of letters, neatly wrapped with a red ribbon, forgotten beneath stacks of newer records. Inside was a series of letters between Caleb and Lawrence Whitfield, the other co-founder. As David unfolded each letter with trembling hands, he found an entire narrative hidden in the worn sheets of paper. The correspondence began formally, with Caleb sharing business strategies and his vision for the store. He proposed innovative ideas, ranging from new sales techniques to unique customer experiences, far ahead of their time. Each letter held Caleb's excitement, his passion for the business, his relentless drive to see it succeed. Yet, as the months passed, David noticed a shift. Caleb's tone turned increasingly cautious, eventually tinged with pain. His suggestions were subtly diminished in responses, and his contributions were downplayed. Then he found the letter that would forever change his understanding of his ancestor. The letter was dated 2 years after the store opened. It was a long, heartfelt piece that seemed to capture everything Caleb had felt but never spoken aloud. His ancestors' words blurred before him, but he could feel the intense ache of each line. "Mr. Whitfield," it began, "I had hoped that our work together would show people what is possible when we set aside our differences. Yet I find myself on the fringes of what I helped build. I watch as my name fades, as my contributions are buried for the comfort of others who have done far less than I. And yet I persist, not for recognition, but for the hope that one day my children or my children's children might walk freely into this place and know their Father's hands built it, that His ideas brought it to life, that His sacrifices were not in vain." David's hands trembled as he held the letter, the words an open wound of pain and resilience. Caleb hadn't been asking for fame or wealth. He had only wanted the dignity of being acknowledged. Yet he had even that stripped from him, his legacy silenced. This man who'd put his heart and soul into a vision had been forced to stand in the shadows while others took the credit. He turned to Kendra, his voice choked. All he wanted was to be remembered, to know that his life's work mattered, and they took that from him. Kendra looked at him with tearful eyes, sharing the weight of the moment. "Then let's make sure he's remembered." David left the archives that day with Caleb's words reverberating in his mind, each line a painful reminder of the cost of erasure. The air outside felt heavier as he walked, his mind swimming with memories of his mother's caution, of his family's reluctance to unearth the past. He understood now. They had feared that looking back would force them to confront the wounds that had scarred generations. But David could no longer turn away. That evening, he found himself outside the store once more, the photograph in the lobby now holding a gravity he hadn't noticed before. He stared at the image, his eyes zeroing in on the scratch where Caleb's face had been. There, in the background, stood his ancestor, a man full of strength and vision, yet denied the dignity of being fully seen. David's heart ached with both pride and sorrow. He stood in silence, a lone figure reflecting on the weight of his family's past and the profound injustice his ancestor had endured. This moment of kinship transcended time, connecting him to Caleb in a way he had never felt before. He could almost hear Caleb's voice, urging him onward, guiding him. He realized that his journey was about more than reclaiming a name. It was about mending the fractures that had reverberated through generations. His mother's reluctance, his family's silence, they had all been struggling under the burden of erasure, a weight Caleb had borne for them all. As he stood there, lost in thought, the store manager approached. She eyed him with disdain, perhaps annoyed by his quiet persistence. "You again," she said, her tone dripping with impatience. "I thought I made it clear. This isn't the place for you." David turned to face her, a quiet power in his gaze. "I have every right to be here," he said calmly, his voice filled with the resolve he had gained from Caleb's story. "In fact, this place is here because of my family." The manager faltered, a flicker of confusion crossing her face. But David didn't wait for a response. He walked past her, standing tall as he placed a hand on the wall where Caleb's initials had been scratched out. His touch was gentle, reverent, as if honoring the spirit that had endured through years of silence. "I'm here, Caleb," he whispered under his breath, "and I won't let them forget you." He left the store with a new sense of purpose, feeling as if he were carrying Caleb's legacy on his shoulders. There was no turning back now. Caleb's story would be told. David would see to it that his ancestor's name was restored, his achievements acknowledged. His family's silence would finally be broken, replaced by a legacy of resilience and pride. That night, as he returned home, David felt a sense of peace settle over him, a quiet triumph that had been generations in the making. He was no longer just a man seeking answers. He was a voice for his ancestor, an advocate for the truth that had been buried for too long. In the days that followed his discovery, David poured himself into creating the exhibit. It was a deeply personal journey, yet he felt an invisible hand guiding him, as though Caleb himself were with him every step of the way. He called the exhibit the Invisible Founder, honoring lost legacies, a tribute not only to his ancestors' erasure, but to all those who had been silenced by history's selective memory. Working closely with Kendra, he assembled pieces of Caleb's story, letters, photographs, documents, and testimonials, all woven together into a powerful narrative that would finally bring Caleb's contributions into the light. Each item was carefully selected to reveal the truth that had been buried, creating a tapestry that honored Caleb as not just a businessman, but a visionary, a man whose belief in equality had been as strong as his commitment to his work. David included the poignant letter he had discovered, displaying it beneath glass where visitors could read Caleb's words and feel the weight of his struggle. The store's current management, resistant to revisiting their origins, initially refused to let the exhibit be held on their premises. But David refused to give up. He contacted community leaders, historical preservationists, and activists who rallied behind his cause, demanding that the exhibit be held in the very place Caleb had helped build. Through their collective voices, they succeeded in securing the store's main lobby as the exhibit space. The announcement drew widespread attention, with local news outlets covering the story, intrigued by the forgotten history that David had uncovered. Opening day arrived, and David stood before the store, now transformed by the exhibit's presence. Rows of photographs lined the walls, interwoven with carefully curated documents, artifacts, and historical notes that brought Caleb's story into full view. As people entered, they moved from panel to panel, reading, pausing, and reflecting. The air buzzed with the energy of rediscovery, of people absorbing a narrative that had long been denied to them. Among the crowd, David spotted his family members. His mother, her face softened by a mix of pride and regret, held his hand tightly as they wandered through the exhibit together. She paused in front of the letter, and her fingers grazed the glass, tracing Caleb's words with a tenderness born from years of unspoken pain. David watched as her eyes filled with tears, feeling as though a weight was lifting from both their hearts. "This is what he wanted, isn't it?" she whispered. "To be remembered like this." David nodded, his own throat tight with emotion. He did. And now, people will finally see him for who he was. Across the room, he noticed the store manager standing stiffly in a corner, watching the visitors with an uneasy expression. Her previously dismissive gaze was now overshadowed by something akin to discomfort, as though Caleb's presence filled the room, making her feel like an intruder in a story she'd never bothered to know. The tables had turned. She could no longer dismiss or ignore Caleb's role, not when it was woven so deeply into the store's very walls. David approached the newly installed plaque, the centerpiece of the exhibit, which proudly bore his ancestor's name. In memory of Caleb Whitman, co-founder, visionary, and equal partner in legacy. The plaque shimmered under the light, its words permanent and undeniable, reclaiming Caleb's place in history. It was a powerful testament to his ancestors' contributions, finally set in stone, where no one could erase it again. The room fell silent as David stood beside the plaque, ready to speak. He hadn't planned a grand speech. Instead, he wanted his words to be as honest and raw as Caleb's had been. "My ancestor, Caleb Whitman, stood in this very space over a century ago," David began, his voice carrying the weight of his journey. He poured his heart and soul into this store, only to see his name erased for the comfort of others. For too long, we've allowed these stories to be buried, as if they didn't matter. But they do matter. Caleb mattered. He took a deep breath, his gaze moving over the faces in the crowd, each one captivated by the story. Today, we honor not just his legacy, but the legacies of everyone whose contributions have been overlooked, whose dreams were dismissed because of prejudice. This is our history too, and we have the power to reclaim it, to bring these stories back into the light. As his words settled into the room, the crowd erupted into applause, a chorus of support and shared conviction. David felt an overwhelming sense of closure. He had done it, not only for Caleb but for himself, for his family, and for every person who had ever felt unseen. After the exhibit closed that evening, David lingered, taking in the empty space now imbued with Caleb's spirit. He felt a familiar peace wash over him, as though Caleb himself were beside him, acknowledging the work David had done. As he prepared to leave, his phone buzzed with a notification. The exhibit had already sparked a social media movement, #RememberOurFounders, encouraging people to uncover the hidden histories of their own communities. The legacy of the invisible founder was spreading far beyond the store, inspiring people everywhere to honor their past and reclaim what history had forgotten. In a quiet moment, David stood before the plaque one last time, placing his hand on the words that finally, after so many years, gave his ancestor his due. He could almost hear Caleb's voice, filled with pride and gratitude. It was as if time had folded in on itself, bringing David and Caleb together across the years. Two men bound by a legacy that would now live on. Months later, David received an invitation to speak at a historic preservation conference. His work had sparked a wave of new interest in lost histories, and other communities had begun organizing exhibits of their own. David's mission, once focused on a single man, had blossomed into a movement of remembrance and reconciliation, challenging society to confront the stories it had buried. In his speech, he left the audience with a final thought, a message Caleb had written in one of his letters, now etched into David's memory. True legacy is not in the wealth we build, but in the lives we touch and the truth we leave behind. Only by remembering can we ever hope to build a future worthy of the past. The room sat in silence as the words sank in, each listener reflecting on the significance of David's journey. As he stepped away from the podium, he saw the faces of people inspired to honor their own histories, people ready to dig deeper, to preserve, to remember. And so, Caleb's legacy became part of a new chapter in the city's history, a chapter that embraced resilience, courage, and the healing power of truth. Through the invisible founder, Caleb's life's work would continue, touching lives in ways he had never imagined, a testament to the strength of those who refuse to be forgotten. As David left the conference, he looked up at the sky, feeling Caleb's spirit once again. He had set his ancestors' story free, and in doing so, he had reclaimed not only his family's history, but his own sense of purpose and identity. And he knew deep in his heart that Caleb was finally at peace, his legacy restored, his name unburied.